myself. I'm the secretary of the Community of Evaluators South Asia, which is a network of evaluators across 6 countries: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, India, and Sri Lanka. And we've just completed our 3rd conclave, what we call our evaluation conference in Kathmandu, along with Eval partners, where we set the global evaluation agenda for the SDGs. So please do visit our website to have a look at it. I'm going to be, after this very provocative speech that you heard, I'm going to be talking about using evaluation to get actionable answers. Not evaluation for the sake of evaluation, but to provide us answers so that we can reach our goals. I'm also very happy to represent gender equity on this panel. All right. I think all of us have talked about the SDGs, and this is just to remind ourselves that it's about the future we want. And there are some key features that we need to remind ourselves when we think about monitoring and evaluation. The important one is that no one is left behind. So we are emphasizing equity. We are also emphasizing the means of implementation along with the goals, very critical. We recognize cultural diversity. And so we recognize that there are different indicators that need to be translated according to the local and cultural context. The goals are all interconnected. So if you do not pay attention to other goals, so if you're talking about education, but you don't talk about poverty, and you don't talk about access, you're not going to be able to achieve your goals. So it reminds us that we live in an interconnected world. And very important for this talk is about follow-up and review. So each of these goals, with the emphasis on measurement, targets, and indicators, is reminding us that we need to follow up and review what we are doing. So what does that mean? It means that we need a robust and an effective, inclusive and transparent follow-up. And we want to do that because we want to promote the demand and use of evidence for policy making. And that's very important if we want to reach our agenda of sustainable development goals. So what I'm going to frame my discussion today is in 3 points. So what so? How do we maximize the role of monitoring and evaluation? And so what? How do we make this evaluation actionable? And the third is, okay, we've got an evaluation, now what? How do we maximize the use and increase the use of evidence? So how do we maximize the role of M&E? Just to remind ourselves here, most of you may know it, but just so that we are all on the same page, monitoring is the routine tracking and reporting of information of the program, of your activities, inputs, and so on. So it's a routine tracking. And when we talk of evaluation, we are making a judgment of the merit and worth of the program. So that is also a systematic collection, but we do make a judgment. So we need to remind ourselves both of monitoring, because we are tracking the means of implementation, and we also want to look at our outcomes, not just our outputs, as we were reminded when we want to do our evaluation. So what do we need? We don't need just evidence. All of us collect evidence, some evidence. But if we want to influence policy, we need very strong evidence. So we have an option. We can have a very good report, but it's not really policy relevant. So you have done your data collection well, sampling well, so on, but does it help to influence policy? Maybe not. You may be having very policy relevant information, but the technical rigor lags. And that's sometimes an excuse provided by many decision makers that, okay, I don't have confidence in the findings that you've provided. So the best option, of course, is to have both technical rigor plus a policy relevant information that gives us better evidence and therefore a relevant policy. So how do we maximize this role? We need to make it local, country-led. And our previous speaker reminded us that in diverse countries such as ours, we need to look at the diversity of stakeholders which is naturally available to us. And we need them to give them a role to lead and own the evaluation process. And so collaboration is the key word. Collaboration for what? to define those big evaluation questions. What are you interested in finding about? And very important is the perspective. We often just look at targets without looking at what perspective are we looking at? What lens do we want to put on? Is it the equity lens, the gender lens, the rights-based? What lens? And that perspective should actually drive what methods we use, how we use our findings and communicate it. So it should not be something that's very techno-fix or technocratic, but it needs to be relevant to our culture and the needs of our countries. I want to stress a bit on the equity aspect because I think this is very critical in the SDGs. The SDGs are meant for all countries. And what it particularly says that we need to track transformation. So we need to look at both success as well as failures. What's happening, what's not happening. We particularly need to look at what are the unintended outcomes. Because we may be having targets and indicators, but we are not actually looking at the unintended outcomes and what's happening in spite of what we set out to do. So, when we talk about equity, this is not what we want. I hope everybody can see at the back. But what we are looking for is something like this. So it's not about equality, which is about the sameness. Equity is about fairness. How do we give those who require a step up? What do we need to add in order to be having an equitable activities, goals, and evaluation? Okay, so how do we make actionable? It's all, we always talk about evaluation and so on. So here we have an example of a program. We say that an investment in adolescents' nutrition is going to lead to the empowerment of adolescents. And we put that out there and that's going to be our program. But really, who says so? Really? Somebody could question that. So one of the methods that we use is to use a theory of change. And the theory of change helps us to articulate what is that change? How does it happen? And what's important is in that context, with that group of people. So we are localizing it and ensuring that we address the issues that are most important to us. And so then we describe our program, what activities will lead us to the expected results. Sometimes theories of change can be very tricky. So should I read that out? Can you read at the back? No? Okay. So here is somebody from the ashram coming and asking Gandhiji, "Dear Mr. Gandhi, we regret we cannot fund your proposal because the link between spinning cloth and the fall of the British Empire was not clear to us." So we need to have a very clear theory of change. So as you probably got from that little cartoon, is that the essence of the theory of change is to link your activities to intended outcomes and impacts. Not on outputs, not on numbers. What is the impact? What's the outcome? So here you have an activity, and here is somebody who says, "What are you doing? What's your activity?" "Well, I'm cutting rocks." But if you link it to the intended outcome and impact, the same activity becomes something like this. I'm building a temple. So it's really important to link our activities to our outcomes. Okay, so what are my activities? How do I place it in my theory of change? So here is a theory of change. You probably have seen it. Inputs, activities, outputs. Very important to go beyond those numbers that we are talking about. And when we talk of education, it's not about bums on seats, as we say, but we want to talk about what's the change that happens as a result of whatever input or intervention you have. What are your short-term outcomes? What are the long-term outcomes? And this theory of change helps us answer what activity was difficult to implement, why was it so, why did it fail, how do we replicate, and so on. However, there is still a problem. There can be a question that if I go from step 1 to step 2, what happened? A miracle? Not necessarily. There are some other areas in the theory of change that we need to be extremely cognizant of, especially when we are looking at SDGs, equity, and looking at with that lens. So if we are building a TOC, you have this slightly linear, you can have it in other ways. But this is not enough. What we need to look at, and this is what we talked about earlier with other speakers, we need to check our assumptions. What are those assumptions that drive our indicators? And unless you place these assumptions center stage, it would be difficult to have relevant indicators with relevant outcomes and impacts that we are looking for. So when we have an open nutrition feeding center, we need to know whether eligible children are there. If they come to eat, do they like the food that's served? If the mothers are learning good nutrition practice, well, do they have the motivation to try out new food? And if they are cooking nutritious food and feeding them, what does the impact relate to? Are there any infectious diseases that are impacting the outcomes? So we really need to check out our assumptions and our subcultures and culture diversity when we are looking at the theory of change. I'm going to the, now what? We have an evaluation, we've got our theory of change, we've got our indicators, we've got it all set out. How do we increase use? Well, we evaluate for lots of reasons, and I'm sure you're familiar with all of these. To make various decisions, to improve programs, to be accountable, and so on. But sometimes, is this how you use your reports? Do evaluations just sit on the shelves? Are you using it as a prop, as furniture? And this is one of the biggest problems with evaluation, that we are not using it in the manner it's to be used. But when you do think about evaluations, there are a lot of questions, and I'm sure all of you face these questions when you're trying to develop an evaluation. So what we need is a new evaluation approach that emphasizes use, users, learning, and ensures ownership of that process. So when we talk about a use-based evaluation, we have to talk about three components. One is the user, the uses, and evaluation focus. I'm going beyond methods and tools and so on. I'm talking about how we can use good evaluation, because unless you use it, you cannot make changes in your programs or policy. So what this really means is that whoever are the evaluation users, we have to work with them to ask them, for what purpose are you going to use the evaluation, and what do you want to know? And we have to identify who wants to know. That's the most critical component in order to use our evaluations. So the user is not the audience. What we normally do is we develop a report, have a dissemination meeting, and assume that it's going to be used by others. But what this approach says is that identify your users and how it's going to be used right from the start. What difference is the use going to make? Well, actually, what it means is that evaluations are not judged by the report. You've given a report, made a presentation, that's the end of your evaluation. What this says is that unless you use that evaluation, the evaluation is not complete. It also means that you need to focus your evaluation. When you want to use the evaluation, when you have a user, you need to focus the evaluation. You need those big key evaluation questions that the users are interested in. And how do you develop those questions? We go back to the theory of change and we select which of these are your big key evaluation questions that you want to address. I just want to end with 4 lessons that are really important when we are thinking about evaluation of SDGs. The first one is that please do remember that evaluations are extremely political. We need to look at the context and our stakeholders. Those evaluations can be thrown out, even if they're good, technically sound, policy relevant, if we've not paid attention to the political nature of evaluations. The second is that it's an extremely powerful resource. So it's very important that we identify who owns it. And the ownership needs to be with multiple diverse stakeholders. Who uses it and who benefits. The third one is that we need to focus on inequities. So we really need to choose our key questions and our theory of change carefully. And my last slide is that let's recognize that there are multiple ways of knowing. It's not just pencil and paper. We have many cultural ways of knowing, and let's respect that. And let's learn to listen and to tell the story. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonal. Our final speaker is representative of Youth Equity.